So for those of you who don't know, today we're here with Boobybiome. Would you like to introduce a bit about the company before we dive
Yeah,
in?
of course. Of course. So I am one of the founders of Boobybiome, and I'm Dr. Sioned Jones. And just a little bit about my background, I guess. I'm a scientist, so I started my career with a sort of scientific degree in chemistry, PhD in biophysics. And during my PhD, I met my two co-founders. So Dr. Lydia Mapstone, who had a PhD in microbiology, and Dr. Tara O'Driscoll, who has a PhD in neuroscience. And we founded Boobybiome in 2019, and we're a biotechnology company based in London, essentially utilising breast milk bacteria to improve infant health. And so we are based in London in one of the world's leading children's hospital, Great Ormond Street Hospital, in the research arm in an institute called the Institute of Child Health.
Such incredible work and so important. And it's so interesting because I feel like for kind of a lot of layman people, I in particular had no idea about the importance of the microbiome within breast milk. And what I'd love to know, what is breast milk microbiome and what makes it so important to babies in that first year of life?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's quite important to just talk about what is the microbiome in general to begin with. And it's basically a community of bacteria that live on and in us. And we actually have microbiomes all over our bodies. So we have them on our skin, we have them in our mouths, we have them in our guts. And it's really interesting thinking about how these microbiomes are actually established. Because essentially, when you're born, you can think of yourself as a blank slate or an empty patch of land. And over time, your microbiome will get seeded, and this occurs sort of between the moment you're born to the age of around 2 to 3. And it's at that 2 to 3 period your microbiome will look much more like an adult microbiome, where it's really established, it's a complex community. And so we get these seeds of bacteria from sort of various things that we're in contact with. So for example, how you're born. If you're born naturally, you'll be seeded by the bacteria in the vaginal microbiome. We then have things like skin to skin contact, where the bacteria in our skin can transfer to the baby. And then, of course, we have breast milk, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but it's a huge source of bacteria for the infants. But we also just have our environment, so a clinical setting, at home, how many caregivers you have, how many pets you have, all these things kind of shape what your microbiome will sort of colonize and look like up until the age of around 2 to 3. And then if we zoom in a little bit more on breast milk and why is breast milk bacteria so important? Well, it's because it contains a huge community of bacteria, kind of over 800 different species, and really beneficial species as well, such as Bifidobacterium, Lactobacillus. And these aren't there just incidental. These are sort of intentionally there, passed on from the mother to the baby via the milk. And so actually, one can estimate that around 40% of the infant microbiome comes from breast milk. And that's what makes the bacteria so important, because they have a whole range of different functions once they've arrived at the gut. They can fight infections, they can reduce inflammation, they can help make a nice gut lining to prevent any leakages. And so they're really important in sort of setting up lifelong health.
Mm. And I would imagine that must have such a huge impact on adult health. And it's something that is going to kind of reverberate through our entire lifetime, surely. What is the impact that it potentially has?
Exactly. Because these bacteria have so many roles, as I said, we now have sort of mounting evidence that show it's not just short-term health, it's long-term health. And just examples of that is, let's talk about preterm infants, for instance. So there's a disease called necrotizing enterocolitis. So breast milk bacteria is known to reduce the severity and likelihood of those diseases. We then fast forward to 2 years of age. Breast milk bacteria is known to reduce allergies. By age 4, asthma, and even obesity by age 5. And there's even studies now that seem to suggest that your infant microbiome can predict things like autism much later in life too.
Gosh, that is crazy that there hasn't been more of an emphasis put on the baby's microbiome in the very.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the reasons we set up the company, because we're seeing this huge rise in these infant diseases globally. And I'm talking about, type 1 diabetes, sepsis, childhood leukemia even. And if you look at all of those children, they all have a common link, and that is the bacteria living in their guts are just severely disrupted. And so when we entered that in sort of the infant feeding industry, we just saw this really obvious gap. And that was just to utilize bacteria to address this rise in infant diseases. But the trouble is, much like so many facets of women's health, breast milk is just understudied. So we knew that it was important. We know that these bacteria are doing things, but it wasn't known in the literature, what are these strains? What are their function? How do they directly influence health? And that's why really for the last 5 years, we've gone out and we've collected breast milk samples from lots of different women. And we've analysed that breast milk microbiome to the highest possible resolution. We've actually now created the world's most detailed database of the breast milk microbiome. And then from that, we had a really clear picture of, what's living in there. And then the next step was understanding how do they work. And so we went into the milk and we isolated and grew those bacteria and analysed each and every one to understand the function that they might have in the infant gut. And our vision is to really sort of translate that research into action and making essentially what is a live microbiome drop that we can give to every infant, and that would contain the bacteria that's naturally present in the breast milk microbiome, so that we can give every baby the best start to life, no matter how they are fed.
Such an incredible product and mission. And like you say, so many aspects of women's health are so understudied. And it's so beautiful to see the synergy between our two companies, because we've done a lot of study research around women's nipples, as you know, and also the data around milk flow. And I just see so many incredible startups coming into this women's health space. And I feel like the more that we kind of partner and come together and share data and share what we're understanding about women's health and support each other, it's hopefully some real impact on the experience for women across the world. And so based off of your the research that you've been doing, what is the vision for your product and how the company is going to develop? What would you like to see come into the world?
Exactly. So really our mission is to bring better health to every baby globally. And that is by delivering a breast milk microbiome to every baby. So at the moment, we're really focusing on between that sort of 0 to 6 months, trying to make sure that if there are factors that could influence their microbiome during that time, such as C-section births, formula feeding, and antibiotic usage, to make sure that we can give them the bacteria that they are missing. But what I would like to touch on is really the sort of long-term vision of the company. And that is sort of a complete personalization route to developing your microbiome. Because our microbiomes are all personalized. Not two women will have the same microbiome. And I'd like to touch on that a little bit more later. But really the mission is that somebody would give birth and they would send a sample of their milk or a sample of their stool sample, and we could screen it based on the database, look what they could be missing, and provide them a bacteria consortia that could really replicate what it is that their baby and their body needs. And so that's really the big dream, and it's kind of innovating not just for babies in that first 0 to 6 months of life, but also providing products for women when they're pregnant, all the way up to sort of age 2 or 3, when I mentioned earlier, when our microbiome becomes a lot more established and complex. But what I will also kind of touch on is that during all of this research, we had a little bit of an accidental discovery. And that was that samples of milk that we'd collect that had been perhaps pumped and stored for a duration of time lost its beneficial microbiome. And what we came to realize is that many of these bacterial species are very sensitive to oxygen. They're called anaerobic bacteria, and they've been adapted to survive in sort of low oxygen environments, such as in our gut and in our breast milk. And so we sort of went on this side quest and basically ended up developing an accessory. And it's an accessory that breastfeeding mothers can attach on any of the sort of infant feeding bottles that they're using, whether that's snatch or nipple. And what this accessory does is it absorbs oxygen from within the milk and within the headspace of the bottle. and it can actually keep the components of breast milk intact and extend the shelf life as well. And so by using this product, we've seen that we can preserve the microbiome, we can preserve the antioxidant content, so your vitamins that are in milk as well, in addition to extending shelf life. And so you'll sort of think, oh, you know, what is Boobybiome doing? We've got a hardware product and then we've got a live microbiome droplet. But really, all of our products have the same mission and vision, which is to really make sure that every baby has that breast milk microbiome to have lifelong health.
Amazing, incredible. I'm so interested about the microbiome, and is there anything that mothers can be doing to improve their own microbiome?
Yes, so kind of touching on the factors that influence your microbiome, your diet and BMI is a really big factor. So we always get asked the question, where does breast milk bacteria come from? And the honest answer is no one really knows. But there is a lot of evidence that suggests that the bacteria that lives in your gut during pregnancy or during the lead up to pregnancy actually gets translocated through your body into your breast milk. And so there's a lot of evidence that supports that, whereby women who are obese or women who have a really poor diet will have sort of a very low abundance of beneficial bacteria in her gut. And in turn, that will result in a lower beneficial bacteria in her breast milk, which will then get passed on to the baby. And so that evidence is very clear. And so there are things that we can do to improve our gut microbiome, which is having a sort of high nutrition diet, also eating lots of fibers-based food, probiotics, prebiotics. And we've actually seen from our own data that women who do have probiotics whilst they're breastfeeding, we can often find them in her breast milk. And so that sort of translocation route is very clear and has been sort of validated by our own studies. But there's also just having a sort of very balanced lifestyle. So physical activity, trying to reduce stress, trying to get as many hours of sleep as you can, because all of these things can actually influence both microbiomes, which will in turn affect your infant.
Mm-hmm. And when we're comparing formula milk to breast milk, what are the similarities and what are the main differences, just so that women out there can kind of understand and have an awareness around what it is that they're actually, you know, potentially babies?
Definitely. And I think it's really important to actually educate on this topic. So I particularly wanted to talk about this. And essentially, when we think about formula milk, it contains all of the macronutrients that the baby needs, but it doesn't contain the same bioactive components that breast milk has. And so it doesn't contain a microbiome. Some people can fortify formula milk with bacteria, but it's important to note that that cannot replicate the complexity of the breast milk microbiome. And so there are certain formula milk companies now actually doing sort of really exciting, innovative things, which is advancing the field. And part of that is basically including sugars, very special sort of human milk sugars in their formula milk. And that's actually probably something that we should talk about, because we've spoken about the microbiome, but breast milk also contains these really complex sugars, and they're called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs. And they actually puzzled scientists for so long because babies can't digest these sugars. And so we were wondering, why on earth have these evolved to be in breast milk when the baby can't digest them? And a few decades ago, or actually a decade ago, we realized that these sugars are actually there to feed the bacteria that's present in breast milk, a very specific type of bacteria called bifidobacterium. And so if the bifidos have the sugars, it means that they can survive and thrive in the gut, create tiny little chemicals called metabolites that can train the immune system. And so going back to the formula milk industry, there are some companies now adding some of these human milk oligosaccharides into their formulas, which is a step in the right direction. But it's worth noting that at the moment, we're at the point that perhaps we can add around 5 of these sugars into formula, where around 200 of them will be naturally present in breast milk. And so I think it's really important to sort of educate the differences there, whilst also emphasizing that, you know, formula milk is a crucial alternative for parents who decide not to breastfeed or can't breastfeed. But really, it would never be able to replicate and mimic how breast milk works in terms of its dynamic nature and the bioactive components that's naturally present.
That's why your product is so incredible. It's going to have impact. many women.
Yeah.
As a mum, could I start? I'm not a mum, but if I, for our mums out there, could we introduce probiotics and prebiotics to our babies, and
Yeah.
for their microbiome?
Yes, so the simple answer is yes, there are infant probiotics that are readily available on the market. The thing is with probiotics is they're basically products that contain bacteria, but they're regulated as food products. So essentially you can put a probiotic on the market showing that the strains are safe to be digested, but it doesn't have to show any clinical efficacy. So the regulations and the barriers to entry are quite questionable. And I actually think that's created a lot of problems for a scientist working in the microbiome field, because it's not really clear cut whether these products work. And if you look at the clinical trials, some of them are quite questionable. And so something that we did when we set up the company was we purchased every single infant probiotic on the market. Well, not every single, the ones that we could get our hands on in the UK in shops like Holland and Barrett's. And what we realized was that some are much better than others because of this poor regulation. There would be some that have not the same strain of bacteria that you'd find on the packet. Others may not even be viable at all. And so if the baby were to digest it, it wouldn't even survive the journey to the gut. And so in answer to your questions, yes, there are, but the quality is very poor. I should also add that not a single one of these probiotics contains bacteria from the breast milk microbiome. And that's again due to sort of lack of innovation in the breast milk microbiome space that could hugely sort of improve the products we have available. The products also contain sort of a minimal number of strains, usually around 1 to 3 different types of bacteria. And that doesn't sort of represent the complex microbiome community that we find in breast milk and what the baby perhaps needs. Another thing is just sort of poor manufacturing, sort of questionable formulations that may not reach the gut and manufacturing not to a high standard. And that's kind of where we see ourselves really standing apart from what is on the market. Sort of creating and rationally designing a product based on breast milk, containing the breast milk bacteria, and also including these sugars, the human milk oligosaccharides, so that then when the baby receives the probiotic, we can actually make sure that they've got the right food source so that they can survive and thrive in a formula-fed infant gut. And so I think there's a lot of improvement that we can do on current probiotics on the market. But that being said, there has been a few really positive clinical studies on some, particularly on diseases such as necrotizing enterocolitis in preterm infants.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of kind of snake oil probiotic market. And we're all aware that we should be taking them, but I think when you're buying something that's kind of off the shelf, sat in the warmth, there's definitely a huge education piece that needs to happen around how to act high quality and impactful probiotics for adults and for children as well across.
And I think it's because gut health is becoming so trendy now, isn't it? It's sort of appearing everywhere. I was speaking to someone the other day about how the word microbiome is now on sort of body wash bottles of brands that have never done any microbiome science. And it's really hard to distinguish between the marketing fluff that's out there and the real science. And it's hard for us as scientists to be able to distinguish that. So imagine if you were the consumer and you've just given birth and you're trying to find out what strain of bacteria you should be giving your baby because of, I don't know, colic. And I can imagine it being a really tough place to navigate. And so that's why education and sort of having Instagram lives like this is just really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a confusing world out there. So when can we expect your products in the market? What's your kind of business vision and launch?
So as for the first product we're actually bringing to market is this device that I mentioned. It's the accessory that we can attach to infant feeding bottles to really preserve all the components that's naturally present in breast milk. And we expect that to come to market around second quarter of next year, which is very exciting. And so at the moment, if there's anyone listening who would like to know more about the product, they can go to our website. We also have a product waitlist available, so have sort of early access to the first batch, and that comes at a discounted price as well. And so we encourage anyone who's interested to sign up to that waitlist. I would also say that we're doing a lot of beta testing at the moment, whether that's using the product, trialing it out, or even completing surveys related to the product. And so on our website, you can sort of go to the chat page, drop us a line, and yeah, therefore have a little trial out. So yeah, exciting times ahead. As for the second product, there's a lot of science that needs to be done still. We kind of, as you said, don't want to fall back into the sort of category of snake oil probiotics, and therefore there's a lot of tests that we need to do to finalize why our consortia is going to be beneficial for the microbiome. So that includes sort of really fun science like testing on an artificial gut, playing around with formulation, and also doing a human study so that we can confirm the final dosage, etc. And so we wouldn't expect for that live microbiome product to come to market until around early 2027.
Such exciting times ahead.
And hopefully a little bit of collaboration with Natural Nipple as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.